Hello, everyone. My name is Mary Magnuson, and I work for the Blandin Foundation as the administrator of the Blandin Community Broadband Program. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to the first in our Broadband Leadership webinar series on creating successful broadband infrastructure projects. This is the series overview. We're offering these webinars to community leaders interested in learning about broadband infrastructure project planning, best practices, and tips for partnering effectively with ISPs and units of government, working with broadband consultants, and successfully applying for public funds. And now let's get started. Today's moderator is Bernadine Jocelyn, Director of Public Policy and Engagement for Blandin Foundation. She will set the stage for today's webinar and introduce the speakers. Take it away, Bernadine.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everybody. Gosh, it's so good to see faces and see names. It's wonderful to gather together and be with our people today. I'm really glad you've joined us in this time of coronavirus. We're all figuring out ways of carrying on our work and trying to keep going, as Katie talked about this morning, getting her kids off, settled. And like most or all of you, I suspect I'm at home today this morning, sitting here in the front room. My husband is upstairs with the dogs, and I hope they're not going to make an appearance during the next hour, but if they do, you'll understand, I'm sure. My husband Dennis runs a business selling vintage magazines online, and so he's actually an example right here in my own household of a business that wouldn't be possible without a fiber connection, because he has to upload all kinds of images to the internet all day. So being self-employed, he works from home anyway, and so his life is a lot less disrupted than mine. Plus, he's an introvert, so I think for him the social distancing stuff is kind of more like a welcome new norm. But at Blandin Foundation, our offices are closed. We're all dispersed to our homes, like you see us today. And in our teams, we're figuring out new ways of continuing our work. We've all gotten these Zoom accounts. We're spending hours on online meetings. And this webinar is an example of what working differently looks like for us. We were gearing up to deliver this content in an intensive 2-day workshop with teams from counties struggling with poor broadband. But since the virus hit, we've retooled, like many of you. And so today we're forging ahead, trying to find out these new ways, work with these new ways of working and learning with one another. The irony of the fact that we couldn't offer this webinar series about how to get broadband without broadband is not lost on me. And so with a nod to the extraordinary times we're living through right now, I wanted to begin again by just really thanking each of you for joining us today. I know it's, as Eric said, he's trying to juggle lots, there's lots going on, but just to get a sense of who's here on the call, Mary's put together a poll that I'm going to ask her to pull up now and see if you guys can all respond to that poll. Let's see who's here in terms of what roles we play in community. So we'll just pause here a minute while people kind of vote, if you will, or fill it in and see what we got.
I see we have 14 out of 21 so far. If for some reason it didn't launch for you, you could go down, or you could go down and see if you can see something in the menu. Or maybe there's a couple people that are on the phone or can't somehow access that.
Sure. I think you're the only one that can see the poll results, right, Mary?
I thought you were able to see the poll results.
No.
Okay, so 2 people work for local government. No elected officials, 2 school employees, 1 local chamber, 1 ISP or other tech service company, 2 citizens working on broadband improvements, and 7 others.
Okay, we got to do a better job on our categories.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, anyway, thanks. That was interesting.
Oh, look at this. Share results.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Can everybody see that?
I would think so.
Nod your heads, people. Yes. Good. Okay.
All right.
47% other. All right. We got to figure out better categories.
Yeah, if you want to type your other into the chat box, that might be useful for us.
Sure. Good. Okay. Well, I actually think that showing up for this webinar this morning, everybody, is in and of itself an act of leadership, because especially now when so much of our time and energy is necessarily drawn to, emergency response in our own lives and as a society, making an investment in planning for your community's future and trying to look out around the corner down the road, I think shows a lot of courage and discipline. So I think part of what we're trying to do is focus on the possibility of a better tomorrow. And you showing up here, to me, suggests that you understand that you yourself as a have a role to play in making that better tomorrow a reality in your community. Those of you who know me know I like to quote Jerry Garcia, and he said, "Somebody's got to do something, and it's just pathetic that it has to be us." So there you have it. It's us. So I want to thank you for caring about your communities enough to join us on this series, because I think, as we all know, change may be inevitable, but progress is optional. So at Blandin Foundation, we care about rural communities. That's pretty much the long and short of why we work on helping communities get the broadband they need and the skills to use it, because we've come to understand that broadband is critical to everything that we care about as a foundation. As I like to say, everything's better with broadband. Everything's better with better broadband. And today, access to broadband and the skills to use it are required to fully participate in society. Especially now in this age of coronavirus, we're seeing how broadband is keeping us all connected across distances of all kinds. And people in communities without broadband access and the skills to use it are getting left out and left behind. Since we began first working on broadband at Blandin Foundation about 15 years ago or so, we've worked with over 71 community partners across rural Minnesota and invested over $4 million to fund hundreds of community projects on broadband access and adoption. Those $4+ million of Blandin's grant dollars have leveraged to $6.5 million in community match and almost $6 million in investments from other funding partners, for a total of almost $17 million in direct investments in broadband access and adoption in rural Minnesota. And communities have used those investments to really make a difference. Things like public Wi-Fi availability in parks, in laundromats, on school buses, in local businesses and coffee shops. Community partners have collaborated with computer refurbishers to distribute computers to over 2,300 income qualifying families across the state, and launched collaborative digital literacy training programs for residents and businesses. And our partnering communities have spurred more sophisticated use of technology through education, training, community events, learning circles, and all kinds of innovative partnerships. We've funded 45 network feasibility studies to date, and of those, about 19 have been either fully built out, partially built, or they're under imminent construction, and a bunch more have been used to develop applications that have been submitted to the state's broadband grant program we're going to hear about from Angie today. That's 25 out of the 45 studies. Of the 110 grants made by DEED's Office of Broadband Development so far, 43 or just under 40% of those awarded communities received technical assistance from Blandin in preparing their applications, collecting data, ensuring that the project reflects community input, and gathering that community support that's so important. So I bow to each of you who've joined us today for stepping up to learn about how to help make successes like this happen in your community. I've heard it said, and I think it's true, that getting broadband is 20% about the technology and about 80% about the sociology. In this webinar series, we're going to talk about both the technology part, some Broadband 101, and we're also going to work on the people part and the process part. How do you generate a shared vision and enough buy-in to carry the project through the inevitable rough spots you're going to meet? I also want to encourage you to check out the worksheets that we've prepared to help support your learning throughout the webinar series. They're available on our website, but Mary's also going to be posting links here in the chat box to those worksheets. I think our hope is you'll find them useful. If you get them out, check them out as they kind of support you as you go through the webinars. We'd love your feedback on them. We're going to be collecting them at the end before the test. Just kidding. We're not going to be collecting them and there's no test. Well, I guess the real test in the end is whether your community gets the broadband it deserves and needs to ensure the future that you want to see. So as I introduce this series today, I just wanted to be sure and emphasize that our overriding goal here in these 10 sessions we're going to be having over the next 5 weeks is to help your community set a vision and a path to get there for better broadband. That's what this is about. Because if you don't know where you're going, you might end up somewhere else. And that's particularly true about broadband. Choosing your broadband provider partners is not like going on a date. It's more like marriage. You want to be sure that you end up with a partner you'll be satisfied spending a lifetime with. So before I turn it over to Bill to take us through the series outline, I want to just quickly thank Angie Dickinson of the Minnesota's Office of Broadband Development for being with us here today for this inaugural webinar. Angie is the first of many broadband champions that you're going to meet during the course of this webinar series. It's really an honor, Angie, to have you with us here to help kick this series off. She's going to be talking about how a robust, community-based broadband development process contributes to quality border-to-border broadband grant applications. So thanks, Angie, for being with us today. And with that, I'm happy now to hand off to Bill Coleman, who's going to take us through an overview of this 5-week series. Bill's the founder of Community Technology Resources, longtime consultant, and well-known to you. Yeah, Bill.
Angie's up next.
Oh, good. So, thank you. Angie.
I'm up next.
Good
morning, everyone. So I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, everyone's seeing my screen now?
Yes.
All right. Well, good morning. My name is Angie Dickinson with the Office of Broadband Development, housed within our state's Department of Employment and Economic Development, also known as DEED. Now I get to, there we go. Thank you for the opportunity to join you today and to share information about our border-to-border broadband grant program. As Bernadine said, these are extraordinary times, and the need for border-to-border high-speed internet access for all Minnesotans has never been more apparent. We are fortunate in our state that thanks to private and public investment, most of our communities have access to reliable high-speed internet service. And we are sincerely grateful for the commitment of our state's broadband providers who are working tirelessly to keep so many of us connected during this pandemic. At the same time, we are also acutely aware of the gaps in broadband coverage in our state and the importance of continuing our work to meet our state's broadband goals. And COVID-19 has certainly intensified our sense of urgency, as so many of us need connectivity for distance learning, telemedicine, and telecommuting. Yet we remain hopeful, and I am certain that Minnesota will come through this stronger, and conversations like the ones we're starting today will keep us moving forward. So here we go. For those of you who may not be familiar with our office or the state's broadband development initiatives, I'll provide a bit of background detail. This timeline slide is included so that you have some of the historical context of broadband policy development in Minnesota. I would note two things about this slide. The first is that the work has been going on for some time, starting back in 2008 and even earlier. The second important point about this slide is that Minnesota's policy and programs have been adopted incrementally and iteratively. Each step has been taken after careful consideration of the new information gathered during the previous step. This has led us to the 4 elements of an approach that we now have in place today, also known as the Minnesota broadband model. This slide shows the 4 tiles that make up Minnesota's broadband policy and program work. When we are asked about the state's broadband plan, we talk about how it is deliberatively high level and dynamic in order to respond to changing conditions and unique combination of variables that exist within each region. The first element to consider are the state broadband goals. These goals set a compass point for all of our work. There are 2 speed goals set in state statute for the years 2022 and 2026, along with goals to be national leaders in both the access and use of robust broadband. The second component is the data and mapping program. This work allows our office and others to measure progress toward the goals, identify gaps, and check for the need for program realignment to address evolving needs and conditions across the state. The third piece provides a focal point and guidance. The broadband office within DEED gives us a place from which to support communities and the providers doing the work to deploy broadband and make sure we are leveraging those investments to the fullest extent possible. The other entity on this tile is the Governor's Task Force on Broadband, which brings together a diverse group of broadband stakeholders to provide guidance on broadband policy going forward. Finally, the grant program was created in 2014 and gives us a tool to materially participate in and collaborate on the solutions to close the gap. The gaps exist because a business case cannot be made to deploy broadband to high-cost areas. This next slide is meant to be a reminder that the office does many things outside of the grant program. I will not read the whole list, as you may have already heard of many of these items. I would just note that some of the items that haven't already been mentioned. Many of these take the form of cross-agency collaborations, our work with the Department of Education and MnDOT and the Public Utilities Commission. This next slide shows some of the broadband mapping data that gives us a quick snapshot of where we stand today when it comes to the state broadband goals. The left map shows that we are making progress overall. It points us toward the areas that may need some additional attention and possibly new strategies to get them to a baseline level of service and hopefully higher. The map on the right shows us that a number of areas are making progress toward the 2026 goal of having a network in place that will support their long-term future, but there is still ground to cover before that goal comes due. We gather this data annually from approximately 115 broadband providers that serve our state. The data behind this map leads to an estimate of about 152,000 homes and businesses that do not yet have access to the 2022 goal of 25 by 3 service, and approximately 293,000 that don't yet reach the 2026 target of 100 by 20 service. The main part of today's discussion is around the tool that the state has put in place to help address the gaps that have been identified. It reminds us that the grant program is a capital matching program that can pay up to 50% of the cost to build broadband infrastructure into unserved and underserved areas of the state. It does not reimburse for the cost to prepare an application, only costs incurred after the contract is fully executed. The legislature appropriated $20 million for a 2020 grant round. The application period has not yet opened for this next grant round, although we are encouraging folks to sign up for email updates regarding key dates and the opening of this next funding opportunity. So stay tuned. Our grant program has had annual general fund appropriations in 6 out of 7 years. Awards are distributed in a single competitive grant round each fiscal year funding is received. The technology must be scalable up to at least 100 megabits symmetrical, and awards are capped at $5 million per grant. This slide is a reminder about who qualifies to apply for the grants, and it can be basically summarized as anyone who is able to prove that they have the wherewithal to build and sustain the delivery of high quality broadband service. And this slide is a summary of the 5 years the program has been funded. The map shows that there have been awards made in all regions of the state, except notably the areas that are already served. 105 million in state funds have leveraged over 146 million in private and local matching funds that have been used largely to push broadband service into unserved areas. One of our responsibilities when managing this portfolio of investments is to learn from what we are doing. Given the many unique situations that exist in the remaining areas of the state that need improvements, we know we will need a variety of solutions to get this job done. This list is just the beginning of some of the trends we are seeing develop, and we'll continue to watch as these projects come fully online. Hybrid networks, next generation fixed wireless, and electric cooperative involvement are all areas we expect to grow in prominence over the next year and beyond. Partnerships and community support are 2 of the hallmarks of our broadband development program. This slide highlights some of the partners in our program: small and large traditional telephone companies, cable providers, wireless ISPs, electric cooperatives, broadband cooperatives, K-12 cooperatives, and of course, local units of government. Broadband initiatives with public-private partnerships and a high level of community engagement tend to result in better projects and better grant applications. I'm going to briefly discuss 4 projects that exemplify these characteristics. You can find additional examples in the grant project summaries on our broadband office website. Forging relationships among stakeholders within a community is key to the long-term success of a broadband project. These relationships help the community to come together around not just putting the infrastructure in place, but making sure that the network is successful because people are using it, which promotes the economic vitality of the community. BevCom and LeSueur County partnered on a $3.7 million project that will upgrade service for approximately 568 locations in rural areas around the communities of Montgomery, Heidelberg, New Prague, in LeSueur, Rice, and Scott counties. LeSueur County created a broadband coalition and conducted a broadband feasibility study. The county also completed a broadband survey of residents, resulting in over 400 responses. BevCom will provide approximately $1.5 million in matching funds, and LeSueur County is contributing $300,000 to this project. Again, going back to that building relationships within the community and that partnership with the provider to ultimately have a successful grant award. Boise Board received a $1.2 million grant. Their project consists of construction of a fiber to the premise broadband network serving 442 households within the Boise Board reservation. Boise Board will construct the infrastructure, and Consolidated Telephone Company, or CTC, will operate and provide broadband service once the network is constructed. Boise Board engaged with the Grizzlies Consortium, a unified tri-community effort between Boise Board, City of Orr, and the City of Cook. This consortium was built upon and driven by the efforts of the Blandin Foundation. The Tri-Community Consortium focuses upon broadband awareness and its effects on communities. Over the past 2 years, the Blandin Foundation has contributed nearly $125,000 in funding for broadband activities, implementation, and advocacy throughout this area, proving the desire, need, and awareness of the Boise Board community. Strong community support, along with multiple funding partners, Iron Range Resources and Rehabilitation, and Shakopee-Wahkiton Sioux community, helped this project move forward. CenturyLink received a $1.8 million grant for Fish Lake Township. Fish Lake Township formed a broadband task force and also surveyed their residents. A Facebook page was created to keep the residents informed of the process, and the survey showed strong support for increasing internet speeds. Letters of support were provided by local residents, businesses, and the Chicago County HRA EDA. Chisago County is also a Blandin broadband community and has been providing free training for small businesses. The BBC provided computers to low-income residents and was able to provide needed information to the residents of Fish Lake Township to promote adoption. CenturyLink contributed $1.6 million to this project, and the township contributed $1.1 million to the project. The last example is the Charter Rosemont project. The residents in the northern area of Rosemont were actively engaged in an effort to improve broadband service offerings in their neighborhood, reaching out to state legislators, the Office of Broadband Development, the City of Rosemont, Dakota County, and Charter alike. The residents of the project successfully engaged state and local government officials and Charter Communications to find a solution to their inadequate broadband service and came up with a cost-sharing plan to extend that service. The state grant was nearly $500,000. Charter contributed approximately $449,000, and Dakota County contributed $50,000. I encourage folks to visit our website for additional resources to assist with community planning. When I'm asked where should a community start with their broadband planning process, I often recommend reaching out to providers who are already in or near their area. Our office can help with providing contact information if needed. There are also links to some wonderful resources through NTIA, as well as links to the Blandin Foundation's website. In closing, I also encourage community leaders to sign up for updates from our office. And please don't hesitate to contact us if you have any questions about our programs. We're happy to help. And that's it for me.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, this is Bill Coleman. I'm gonna share my screen here. Oh, so there it goes. Mary, I did something here. There we go. Thank you.
There.
But I can't advance them now all of a sudden. Maybe there. Oh, there we go. So
Got it?
I do.
There you go.
So thank you, everyone. And you know, I think I've got a wrong file here. Hold on one second. I'm sorry.
You know, while Bill is finding the right file, I am going to call up the second poll.
Thank you, Mary.
Yeah, so this poll is on how would you characterize the status of your community's broadband development process? So you should see it now. There we go.
Good, thank you. Sorry for my confusion there. I think I had some PowerPoint version issues there, so thank you so much. I'm Bill Coleman, and I'm lucky enough to work with Blandin Foundation on a contract basis to help work directly with communities to help improve community broadband services. And this is my broadband development process simplified. If only achieving broadband improvements were this simple, like flipping a switch, click. Unfortunately, as Bernadine said, if you're participating in this webinar, you understand it can be a difficult path towards ensuring your community has broadband infrastructure and services that at a minimum meet state broadband goals and ideally positions your community for the future. This is more like the community broadband planning process. Yeah, much more complicated, many more steps. The idea of awakening to begin to work on broadband service, elected officials hearing from their constituents or local businesses, go to a conference. Many times it's somebody's personal broadband experience that they have, that they cannot work from home. A school superintendent in rural Stearns County became chair of the Broadband Coalition in his county once he has just moved to the town. His wife brought her telework job with her and couldn't get broadband service in the community where they were located. And so that is a whole number of reasons or ways people come. And then gathering data through meetings and surveys, beginning to determine the range of acceptable community roles, assess your independent consultant or your incumbent providers and prospective providers, conducting a feasibility study. We heard Angie talk a little bit about that. And then identifying and selecting your provider partners. We know that many communities in this session have probably been through a fair number of these steps already. And we've got a few arrows. This is kind of like the game of life for chutes and ladders where your path gets off track and you need to go back to the start. And that in a real community broadband initiative, there's many more of those arrows that send you back towards the to the beginning. Many communities are able to jump ahead because they have a great provider partner, a local circumstance, and they get to skip many of these steps, and they should consider themselves very lucky. This is a graphic from the Art of Hosting folks. It shows what they call the chaotic path, the combination of chaos and order. It demonstrates a range of operating styles from complete anarchy on the left side to complete control on the right side. The middle circles show the balance between chaos and control. The far left here is illustrative of our current broadband marketplace, providing gigabit wireless to urban football stadiums while providing no broadband in many rural places, mostly determined by mid-20th century decisions of who got to provide service where. The spot between the far right circle, control, and order, was the dominant model for telecommunications until the 1996 Telecom Act, which brought competition into the marketplace, but left behind the status quo and best practices. Community broadband practices are in the middle of the diagram between chaos and order. As the graphic shows, innovation resides between them. With private sector broadband providers, much of the chaos takes place behind closed doors until service disruptions harm customers and bankruptcy filings are made. Public chaos, even minor, is in the open. It's in the newspaper, it's on the radio, it's in discussions in the coffee shops. It takes great community leadership to manage this open communications paradigm. Throughout the series, you'll hear speakers talk about their balancing act between chaos and order. Look at the results of the poll. Mary's going to publish those now. We'll see what comes up.
Only 13 out of 24 voted.
Okay. And I can't see that on my screen, Mary.
Oh, really?
You got the results?
Oh, that's because you're sharing.
Yeah.
So 5 people, or 33%, are just beginning their organized efforts. 3 people, or 20%, have partnered on and submitting broadband grant applications and have submitted broadband grant applications. And 7 have successfully improved broadband in parts of our community, but have more work to do.
Okay, thank you. We got a good distribution there. It's really important throughout this webinar series for you to help us, do the best job that we can. And that means really providing input and asking questions, and even before or after sessions to send us your questions and let us know what you really want to learn. We'll now briefly go through the webinar series and show you what we're covering, and you'll see that we're covering this entire broadband development model that we talked about. And here's today. You can see it's a big overview on the graphic there. On Thursday, we've got a great session about setting the vision, the hows and whys of developing a community broadband vision. Vision drives decisions. Our speakers will share their stories of chaos and order as they worked and continue to work on them on broadband development. We know that in many places you can't attack the whole area at one time, and so there is incremental progress, both in terms of coverage and the quality of that coverage. You'll see that the vision is not usually developed in a single moment, but is created, shared, and adopted, and even adapted over time. So it's not just a single, let's get together and create a vision. This is a real learning and iterative process. A week from today, we'll hear from technology experts. Calix is a leading manufacturer of fiber to the home equipment, and many Minnesota internet service providers use their gear. You'll learn at a high level about how fiber networks operate and emerging capabilities. On the wireless side, we'll hear from MVTV Wireless, which is one of Minnesota's oldest and most successful fixed wireless providers, operating primarily in Southwest, South Central, and West Central Minnesota. I'd like to give them a shout out because they are always ready to partner with communities on deployment and adoption work. You'll see that it's helpful at the beginning of the process to learn about broadband technologies, and that knowledge only increases as you get farther into those choices, into those decisions. So a lot of these elements are repetitive and, again, iterative as you move through the process. Community broadband surveys is next Thursday. And they serve multiple purposes with multiple audiences at different times in the process. There are many survey strategies to gather valuable consumer information that will shape the attitudes and decisions of elected officials and internet service providers. Our speakers bring great knowledge and experience from all sides of the table. You'll learn about the survey best practices and common mistakes that affect survey validity. When the surveys are done, sometimes when you're doing a survey at the beginning of the process, you're really trying to understand your community at a high level, but to really use the results to educate other community leaders and elected officials. When we heard about these grant projects, when you hear townships bonding for $1 million or counties contributing funding, that is takes leadership, but leadership follows public opinion many times. So you'll see that surveys targeted towards that community opinion at the beginning, and then surveys targeted towards provider opinion as you go through the process. Convincing a broadband provider that there is a marketplace is really an important step for communities. And it really helps the provider decide where to go first. There's a lot of surveys completed and they say, yes, we want broadband at a certain price. And that's spread throughout a county. We'll really see clusters of respondents that are more easily served. And so getting those surveys done right is really an important step. Broadband mapping, Angie talked about the Office of Broadband's maps, and we've really seen in the last, I would say, 18 months to 2 years, the emergence of GIS mapping tools being used, again, to map survey results, to do cost estimates, and so on. It's really gotten to be a real science on how projects move forward. These are also really important for the grant applications. Communities need to understand how the maps, using data submitted by broadband providers, affect prospective broadband provider interest and grant eligibility. Learn how you can gather the evidence necessary to get maps to more accurately reflect actual broadband service levels. Because the maps, sometimes the providers provide information by census block rather than by address. Maybe because their providers are anxious to show they're doing the job. Many times community members think that those maps are overly optimistic in the service levels. And so that learning how to gather the data to get them accurate is really important. And again, you can see mapping takes place in a couple different places in the process. The state broadband maps, though, are a great resource for starting any community discussion on broadband availability. Ownership models and provider partnerships. Community teams, broadband teams, often have a limited view of the various ownership and partnership models that exist, and too quickly make decisions that limit or preclude successful broadband development projects. Ownership and operations are two very different decisions. Learn why some excellent candidates for community broadband partnerships would prefer that the ownership of the network be in the public hands, and how public ownership provides future-oriented opportunities that privately owned networks might preclude. Many of us have heard about smart communities and all the devices that can help with traffic and water metering and all kinds of electricity use. A lot of those smart city applications really require publicly owned infrastructure to enable the many, many devices that are going to be on a network. Minnesotans by nature say, hey, we'll let the providers do this, own the network and do everything. And that is an easy and clean way to do things, to provide just a grant to a provider. But there's real benefits, and especially when you think of long-term, to think about the benefits of public ownership. And a lot of those discussions are made through the feasibility study process that we'll talk about next. Feasibility studies provide accurate information about deployment and operating costs, as well as revenues. The studies provide a basis for negotiating with private sector partners or for determining ownership and partnership arrangements. The feasibility study, when properly designed and implemented, should become an interactive decision-making funnel. Again, if we go back to that chaotic path, that is where that innovation and best practices emerge. Learn how one Minnesota-based consulting firm has worked with clients to turn feasibility studies into successful broadband development projects, including both fiber optics and fixed wireless connectivity. We'll also hear from several of their clients to describe how they've used those feasibility studies as that decision-making funnel. We've seen some feasibility studies that were kind of, consultant comes in, does a study with very little input and decision-making from a community team, and you kind of get a generic study and a big price tag, X million dollars, however big that project is, from 10 million to 30 to 50. And for the communities that have not done the work of organizing a team to lead this process in the community, oftentimes that's the end of the project. The big number scares people away from really addressing the situation. Where if you do have a team, you recognize that that big number is based on a long-term financing program and also a lot of revenue coming from the fiber network or even a wireless network. So it's really important to understand that feasibility study and have an engaged local team to stand side by side with the feasibility consultant to get the highest value from that. You'll note that on a couple of these slides, we don't have our speakers set yet. And this is kind of a design build operation as we go of this a webinar series. And we're excited that with who we have, and we're have other folks in the loop that we're still finalizing. So we'll announce those new speakers as they come online. Of course, if rural broadband projects were financially profitable, they would just happen through the private sector without government intervention. But we know that to build rural broadband networks, it takes subsidies, just like rural telephone networks and rural electric networks required subsidy. Federal government in the 30s and then in the 40s said, you know, first we should have electricity, then we should have telephones, and set up a system to make that happen. So people at the end of the gravel road would have a telephone. I should note that many times those people at the end of the road might have had a party line telephone equivalent to a dial-up internet service. So the phone services, the electric services didn't happen all immediately. People built into that. But we know that federal and state broadband programs are essential to making this happen. We know that there's, over the last couple of years, we've seen a bigger emphasis with state broadband funding, where those numbers have gone up recently. And now the federal government has been pretty active in trying to address the broadband digital divide. We know that this virus and the pandemic is only going to spur more of that discussion about broadband as a utility. Just a few years ago, when people brought that idea up, that broadband was a utility, there was a lot of pushback that it was an optional service and there wasn't necessarily a big government role. But I think we're seeing that now in the impact of educational delivery, people working from home, healthcare information, and so on, that it clearly is more of a utility. And so we're going to have an Office of Broadband Development representative. We have somebody we think lined up from the NTIA through the Department of Commerce. But rather than have a series of folks talk about program rules and regulations, we thought we'd bring in some telecom providers who have used these programs in a number of different ways in partnership with communities to have that be more on the ground, real life experience and advice rather than kind of people reading off the fact sheets. So I think that's going to be a great presentation. As Angie noted on some of the projects, local funding has come into place. And so we're lining up presentations of folks who have marshaled their local resources in support of projects with or without other state or federal broadband dollars. And so that is going to be a very interesting session as well. We'll get into some of the technical details of bonding and the financial powers of the communities, but also the real life experience, again, of various cities, counties, and townships that have contributed financing. Making it happen, strategies for success. Our speaker, Allie McInerney from Blandin Foundation, is an expert in messaging and helping communities communicate within their community and to important key stakeholders outside the community. And so this will be kind of a summary session about how do you move this process through, as Bernadine noted, more on the sociology side of things, and as opposed to the technical terms on this. So you can see that we've covering the gamut on our series here. I want to let people know that since these are recorded, when you have people in your community that should know about these sessions, they can watch them at their leisure. You can get together your team for have a little lunch once we're being 6 feet apart, or even have your own Zoom session to watch. I'm not sure how that would work, but once we're back to a little more normal, to bring your team together. And I think this series is going to be a great way for people to increase the knowledge that you need to have successful projects. And we know that at the end of the process, like anything else, a construction project, when you're home remodeling, all the things you wish you had known at the beginning, you learn at the end, but you think, wouldn't that have been good to know at the beginning? And we hope that this series will really help with that. As Angie mentioned, we have Minnesota Broadband Resources, the Blandin Foundation. Program information is the broadband.blandinfoundation.org. The blog is something that is an everyday webinar in terms of resource that brings local and national information about broadband to bear. So great collection of stories there. You can also, as Bernadine likes to say, go in and search. So if you're looking for finance or fiber or wireless, you can just type those words into the search box and come up with some great articles of what's happened around Minnesota. And now this blog has been active for 5, 8, 10 years, I think. So there's a lot of data there. And then of course, the broadband maps and so on from the Office of Broadband are there. And those are also very helpful. And don't be afraid to click around and use that interactive map. Other resources, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance has a lot of great information about local ownership of broadband networks and how communities are doing that. Next Century Cities has an excellent little toolkit, about 10 pages, that is extremely well done. So I encourage you to take a look at that. The federal government website, of course, is rich with information. If you're thinking that you really want fiber in your community and you're looking for arguments to support that, the Fiber Broadband Association, don't be afraid to register so you can access their information. You do have to log on for that. And then Michigan, they have a statewide school education network out of Michigan State, the Merit Network, they call it. And they've done a Michigan Moonshot, which in true university fashion, they brag they have about 900 pages of resource online, but there are some tremendous resources in there. And as you think to justify your network investment, even before the pandemic, they've really documented the impact of connectivity on school performance. People who are connected just do better in school. and irregardless of income or socioeconomic status. And so just really shows the impact on children's lives as they grow into adulthood to be able to realize the benefits of connectivity. So with that's my presentation. And I just want to encourage people to spread the word about the series. And I think on the worksheet, you can kind of see, who should be invited to different sessions. So maybe invite your banker to attend the finance sessions. Maybe just look through that list, and your technology folks can get all into the technology. The key is to build a team that has this knowledge. It's not a one person sitting there in their office. It's really who's on your team, how can you increase their knowledge and expertise. You'll also realize who you can then talk to later, building connections, build a network to help build a network, I would say. So with that, I'll turn it back to Mary.
Thanks, Bill. If anyone has any questions, now would be the time to put it in the chat box. Ann Tracy, the main author of our blog, says that we started the Blandin on Broadband blog in 2007. And if anyone has a story to share with her, send it to her. You can either send it to me and I'll put you in touch with Ann, or just go to the blog and message her. If you have a question and you just want to unmute and say anything, just go ahead. Otherwise, and I'll just speak really slowly for a moment. On Thursday at 9 a.m., we will continue this webinar series on creating successful broadband infrastructure projects with Setting the Vision. For more information on the series or links to join, visit broadband.blandinfoundation.org and click on the webinar banner. Thank you to Bill and Bernadine and Angie for presenting today, and thanks everyone for being on the webinar. Later today, probably maybe tomorrow, you can find the recap and recording of today's webinar, and please share it with your friends and colleagues. Thank you everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.